Hey everybody, what's going on? Let's kind of kick today off with some micronutrients and a little bit of water action. By this point, you guys have had the lectures, so you should have a pretty good idea of what's going on. Realistically, I'm not expecting you guys to just love this section, so bear with me. If you do love this section, that's awesome. Rock on. We can talk more offline. For those of you guys that kind of struggle to get through this section, I know it can be tough because you kind of don't see some of the connections that are super important here. So my goal with kind of working you guys through the lecture and as well as working you guys through this video is to really just discuss how this matters, why this matters. So before we go too much further, let's kind of talk about what a vitamin is. Realistically, a vitamin is kind of just like an accessory nutrient, right? It's not something that's going to be directly giving us energy. It's not really something that's going to be directly contributing to body mass. Minerals provide a pretty significant amount of mass to us, right? Like 4% of our body weight. Vitamins aren't going to be doing that. Vitamins are something that we need to serve as activators, as cofactors, as things that kind of help kind of kick us off, right? Like they kind of help us live life in a normal fashion. So there's really a couple different types of vitamins that we divide into two different groups. So we're going to have fat soluble and we're going to have water soluble. Solubility in fat just means that it kind of more or less just dissolves inside of fat. It's going to be predominantly transported on fat. I hate this microphone. It's going to be transported on fat, or it's going to be transported in water. That comes to be important when we're talking about fat in the diet, when we're talking about how fat gets transported throughout the diet, and it also kind of explains some of how some supplements just make for expensive pee, right? Since we store high levels of fat, we can actually store high levels of fat-soluble vitamins. And that means that we might actually start running into some toxicity issues if we start getting too high with vitamins A, D, E, or K. Water soluble, less likely, but still possible, because when we start to build them up, we just pee them out. So our fat soluble vitamins are really going to be transported as part of lipoproteins. So last lecture, we talked about lipoproteins, high density lipoproteins, low density lipoproteins, very low density lipoproteins, chylomicrons, right? We kind of covered that. With those lipoproteins having so much fat, they're also going to be used for transporting vitamins across the system and across the body. One of the major problems with going on these prolonged fat-free or ultra-low-fat diets is going to be that we don't get the vitamins in the quantity that we really need. So it's actually going to lead to a vitamin insufficiency. So because of this solubility, we can run into those toxicities. Just for example, vitamin A and vitamin D in high doses can lead to sensory nervous issues, and then high dose vitamin D can also cause calcium deposits and harm the kidney and heart function, right? Kind of scary stuff. For this slide, rather than just sit here and read through it and kind of go through it word for word, what I want you guys to be paying attention to is what does each one of these major vitamins do? What are a couple of sources for these major vitamins, and then what's a deficiency really look like, right? Helping to identify deficiencies can be huge depending on what clinical practice you're trying to go into. So our water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C and vitamin B complex. It's called vitamin B complex because it's kind of complicated with how many of them there are, right? So, and I'm not completely kidding. These water-soluble vitamins are going to be really important cofactors for us. I think that it was Caleb Moss pointed this out in class, which kudos to him. Niacin and flavine are going to be two major cofactors in NAD and FAD. And for those of you guys that have had phys or you're in exercise physiology now, you know just how important NAD and FAD are, right? They are massive hydrogen and electron transporters for us for making ATP. Super important. In general, regardless of whether it's flavine or niacin, these vitamins are going to act as cofactors. So they're going to help facilitate chemical reactions, and they're going to kind of be present in super critical steps throughout the system. So if we did not have these vitamins, then we would not have a normal operating system. If we have a normal operating system, it'd be like getting a blue screen on a computer or having a frozen computer. It just sucks, right? So I kind of already mentioned this before, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it, but essentially due to the water solubility of water-soluble vitamins, because of the water solubility of water-soluble vitamins, we're not going to have any sort of appreciable storage of those. And so that means that we don't really have to worry about too much excess building up. And realistically, diet deficiencies, when we're 50% or greater deficient in something, they may take time. They can take up to 4 weeks to really start to express some of those deficiencies. Again, just like with the fat soluble, pay attention to some of the vitamins, the dietary sources, a couple of functions, right? Get the big picture here. Am I going to ask you for every single word on this chart? No, I'm not going to. But it helps to have an idea of what a couple of these are, right? Like, what is folate? Why is folate important? What is niacin? Why is niacin important? Where can we find it? What is vitamin C? Why is it important? Where can we find it, right? Just take a couple of them and learn them pretty well. It'll help you guys in the long run. If you haven't noticed by now, I try to do my best to kind of put stuff together and then give you guys a picture, or try to sum stuff up in a picture or a figure of some sort. That's kind of what we're going with this slide, right? I want you guys paying attention to how many different things vitamins are going to be responsible for, right? Like, it is a lot of stuff. Everything from bone to cell membranes to hormones to blood clotting to teeth to eye function. We have to have vitamins inside of our body, and we have to have them functioning, and we have to be able to absorb them from the diet. With that being said, how do we get these vitamins from the diet? What kind of quantities are we looking for? What actually makes it consumable in higher levels? All that type of stuff, right? Well, relatively recently, 2020 is not when it was just updated. 2015, 2014 is when the DRIs were updated to really encompass the RDA, the EAR, the AIs, and the TULs, or the ULs. And what all those letters mean is it's just giving us an idea of how much vitamin and how much mineral we need to be consuming, right? So the RDA is the recommended daily allowance. The EAR is estimated average requirement. The adequate intake is the AI, and the upper intake level, or the tolerable upper intake level, is the higher end for toxicity, or the upper limit, or the UL. The goal here, right? This is a global and sweeping recommendation in order to cover as many people as possible while not having harmful occurrences happen, right? We basically want to avoid overconsumption, but minimize underconsumption. So we're trying to go with a silver bullet type approach, but we're also trying to cover the biggest majority of individuals, the biggest population that we possibly can with one number. It's kind of a difficult thing to do. So here's a little bit more on the definitions. What I want you guys to pay attention to is kind of the numbers, right? Like, RDA is 98%. The goal is to cover 98% of people, to make sure that it is an adequate intake for 98% of people. Upper intake level is going to be the highest level of consumption before toxicities actually start to present. And then the EAR is the mean level of daily nutrient intake, or the average level of daily nutrient intake. So I like to see these in pictures. Personally, I think it makes a little bit more sense. So what you get here is you get a standard normal curve, or a bell curve. For those of you guys who have had statistics, you're used to seeing these. In general, what we're looking for is that very center of the line, very center of the hump, right? Right where the blue and yellow meet. That's going to be the 50th percentile. So that is literally bang on average, right? 50th percentile, not 51, not 49, bang on average. So that's going to be the EAR. So that is our estimated adequate range, essentially, right? Like, we're hoping that we're going to meet 50% of people's requirements by having an EAR set here. Now, the RDA is a little bit more specific, right? We're trying to cover 98% of people. So we're trying to get a coverage level where 98% of people will not experience deficiencies, and realistically not experience toxicity or upper level intakes. So it's kind of a goofy number, right? What is important to note here is that there's still 3% of the population, approximately, that needs more than the RDA. So they're going to need to take in more nutrition of some level when it comes to vitamins and minerals above and beyond the RDA. Think for a second, hit pause, and try to figure out why we would care about that green section in this class, right? Think about the name of the class, Nutrition for Performance. What groups might fall into this 3% of the population? Hit pause. Once you come up with a couple ideas, join us back. One major population that you're going to have to worry about here is our athletes, right? Especially our distance athletes. Another major one is our female athletes. We'll talk a little bit more about female specifically later on. But in general, female athletes might be more at risk for deficiencies than male athletes. It just happens, right? There's hormonal differences between the two groups. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. Pregnancy is going to be something that is associated with an increased vitamin need. And then for all of the individuals that want to become physical therapists, what's your bread and butter population? What's the population that's going to probably make you the most money? It's going to be your elderly folks, right? It's another group that might need more than the RDA for certain vitamins and minerals. Awesome. So where is this going to put us with supplements, right? Where do you think supplements play a role? If we already said that the RDA is going to be set so that 97 or 98% of individuals are able to meet adequate levels, they're able to meet all of the minimum levels needed for health, why do supplements exist? One, it's a great way for companies to get you to spend money. Two, if you really enjoy expensive pee, it can be helpful, right? Realistically, individuals who expend normal energies or even excessive energy typically do not need to have supplemental vitamins and minerals added to their diet. Now, is that to say that there's absolutely not a need for them? No way, shape, or form am I saying that, right? But it is oftentimes unnecessary. It is oftentimes not needed to supplement vitamins and minerals in the diet as long as you are consuming a normal and healthy diet. Something to think about. What are some populations that might not meet their adequate intakes, that might not meet the levels that they possibly need? Almost always in nutrition, we're going to have an asterisk, and it's going to be pregnancy. Pregnant women typically have advanced needs. They're going to have some level of additional requirement because they are literally growing another human inside of them. So that could be blood, it could be oxygen, it could be whatever, right? There's going to be dietary needs that have to be increased in order to meet demand of the child. So that's one. What's another population? Right? Elite athletes that are females might need a little bit more. Our older population might need a little bit more. Patients with something like AIDS, patients with a chronic wasting disease, patients with cancer or on chemotherapeutics, right? Like there's no shortage of answers here, but it's not going to be the average or the standard normal individual that is going to need those supplements. So just something to kind of think about. Here what I've done is I've kind of put all the vitamins together with the dietary sources and bodily functions and deficiencies for you guys so you have something to review. I'm not going to ask you too many specifics. Like I'm not going to need you to fill in this table all over again. But again, have a general concept of what is going on with each one of these vitamins, where you can find it, that type of stuff. Here, I have never personally had to use any of these values. I will never expect you guys to do something that I have never had to do myself or had to use myself. You will always have these available for reference for you, so don't stress too much over learning those, but do pay attention to what some of the requirements look like and how they change across the age span, the health span, all that type of stuff, because the needs do change and they change dramatically. So antioxidants. A big thing that vitamins are generally associated with it is this concept of antioxidants. In general, antioxidants help to fight free radicals. They help to fight oxidative species and reactive oxygen species. We generate those oxygen species at the third pump or in the electron transport chain. So we're actually going to create free electrons, and we're going to start having these negatively charged oxygen molecules that can actually cause some pretty big damage inside of the body. A couple of conditions that might increase oxidative stress, cell aging. So as we age, our cells age as well. Cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all that type of stuff. Exercise is actually going to cause massive levels of oxidative stress. Think about what we're doing. We're putting an overburden, like an incredibly high burden on the electron transport chain when we're going through exercise. So we're going to be forcing it to kind of create some oxygen species, reactive oxygen species. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but as long as it's handled, it can be a benefit for us, as well as kind of decline in CNS function and immune function as well. So kind of diving a little bit more into that physical activity and exercise thing and the reactive oxygen species. As we increase our metabolic rate, as we increase our metabolism, as we continually rely on the use of things like electron transport chain in high production pathways for ATP, we're going to get electron leaks, we're going to get proton leaks, and we're going to get issues developing. Is it a bad thing? No, not necessarily. It can be a good thing. This is actually the agent of change, right? So oftentimes when we think about exercise, we're thinking that it is a pretty radical deviation away from homeostasis. What we're creating is a new set point to occur. Essentially, when we exercise, we stress the body to a huge level. These free radicals also stress the body to a huge level. Our body works to repair those free radicals and grow back stronger. We start to identify where those free radicals came from and start to grow back stronger. So it's not a bad thing, right? We want to have some of these, but at the same time, too many is a bad thing. So a couple of examples for you guys of dietary antioxidants. Some of these you're going to be familiar with, right? A lot of times you're thinking blueberries and stuff like that. A couple of kind of major sources for antioxidant vitamins: beta-carotene, vitamin C, and vitamin E. Vitamin C tends to be citrus, right? Most of us are pretty good at knowing what vitamin C is. Beta-carotene, it's going to be the pigmented, that kind of in foods that are pigmented with kind of an orange or a yellow, as well as kind of green leafy vegetables. So you'll see beta-carotene in carrots. Carotene, carrots, that one's easy to remember. Sweet potatoes, also orange. Apricots, cantaloupe. Have you ever heard someone say cantaloupe? Hilarious, right? Weirdos. Vitamin E, vegetable oils, wheat germ, whole grain bread, that type of stuff. Where else can we find vitamin E? It's a fat soluble vitamin. Why do we want to be able to fight these free radicals? One, adaptation to exercise. Two, it's going to help influence our DNA. We're also going to help block some of that uncontrolled cell growth. Some of you guys might know cancer is actually uncontrolled cell growth. So by actually exercising and forcing our body to get better at handling oxidative stress, and by consuming a diet that's rich in antioxidants, we can actually fight some of the negative side effects and block some of the negative side effects from occurring. Something else that I kind of want to point out to you guys is one of the proposed mechanisms for how heart disease actually occurs. So homocysteine is something that is produced in the body, but normally it actually converts to a couple of other amino acids. There's 3 major B vitamins that are going to control this: folate, B6, and B12. If you have a deficiency in any one of those 3 vitamins, it might actually damage the process and cause this overburden of homocysteine. So that's kind of what this picture is demonstrating. The concept is that if we're missing those 3 key B vitamins, then our homocysteine will not disappear. Like, we won't be able to convert it into other amino acids. And as that homocysteine is traveling through our artery walls, it's actually going to scratch along those artery walls. And those scratches are sites of inflammation. And that inflammation facilitates fatty deposits. And then we get those cholesterol streaks, we get those fatty streaks, we get atherosclerosis. So a major proposed defense against that is to make sure that you're getting in enough vitamins that are going to help in the conversion of homocysteine to other amino acids. So diet and high in fresh foods is going to help. Diets that are high in B12, B6, and folic acid are going to help. And for those of us that happen to be deficient in those or struggle to get them in the diet, that's when we can use supplementation, right? When you're struggling to get it in. We are zooming through this. Not really. I know it's painful. I apologize. But minerals are going to be where it actually starts getting a little bit exciting. At least for me, I don't know, maybe because I'm an idiot, maybe because I'm a weirdo. At least minerals are a little bit more exciting because they are. So minerals are kind of cool because they actually make up a pretty sizable amount of our body mass, right? 4%. 4% of your body mass is due to freaking metals of some level, essentially, right? That's really kind of crazy to think about. There's 2 different real categories for minerals. Just like we had different categories for our vitamins, I apologize if you can hear my dog going ape. There is actually a major and a trace mineral category. The major minerals we have to consume in greater than 100 milligrams daily. Trace minerals want less than 100 milligrams daily. just so you guys can kind of see what some of the sources are for these major minerals. We're going to have calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, magnesium. If you look over there on the left-hand side next to the mineral, you're going to see the dietary source. For the most part, a lot of these are going to see some sort of dark leafy green, right? It tends to be a little bit easier when you're thinking about what color of food you're eating, as well as generally what you would prescribe for a nutritious diet, right? Think about some of these things when you're starting to think about diet. What is it that are in the color? What are the flavonoids that are going on, right? But also, what are the minerals that you're consuming? If you look at the major bodily functions, you're going to see some kind of structural things, but you're also going to see some things that have to do with muscle conductance, or you're going to have to do with muscle contraction or blood clotting, right? Like, this is where some really important things are going to start happening. Not saying that vitamins aren't important. They're incredibly important. We have to have them. But minerals start getting a little bit more into like more structural changes as they're occurring. So again here, iron, fluorine, zinc, copper, selenium, iodine, chromium, same thing, right? We're going to talk about each one of these. Again, DRIs, I don't feel that you guys need to stress over these numbers. I've never had to use them before. I bet you will never have to use them before either. And if you ever do need to, you can pull them up on Google. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about why a mineral function is important. Well, let's just start off with a little bit of an easy one. Calcium. What does calcium do for us? It's going to help provide structure for our bones, right? Calcium in bones is huge. In class, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but calcium is going to be a major player when it comes to skeletal muscle contraction. As calcium binds to troponin, we have a tropomyosin shift, blah, 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 right? Calcium leads to skeletal muscle contraction. Without calcium, we do not have contraction. So minerals are going to be mission critical when it comes to both catabolic and anabolic cellular processes. They're going to be mission critical when it comes to movement-based processes, the execution of mechanical work, all of that. Also, if you start looking at things like magnesium, it's going to be massively critical when it comes to how do we actually break down carbohydrate. There's other minerals that are going to be super important for how do we break down lipids and how do we break down proteins. Other parts of this are going to start forming hormones for us, right? Like our iodine is going to help control our thyroxine. It's going to help control what our thyroid hormone is doing, and it's going to help control the function of our thyroid. Like, these are major things that are due to small minerals, 4% of our body weight, right? It's really cool. Now, just because we eat something doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to absorb it, and just because we absorb it doesn't necessarily mean that our body's going to be able to use it. This idea is called bioavailability. So how likely is it that we put something into our mouth or into our body and it actually is available for use, and we can get sustenance, or we can get activity, or we can get something out of it. We can actually take something from it, right? A good example of something with low bioavailability would be like fiber, right? Like, we can ferment it, but we can't actually break it down and use all of its individual parts. So food type is going to be massive. Where our food comes from is going to be big. In general, humans are going to do a better job pulling nutrition, pulling vitamins, pulling minerals out of animal products than we are out of plants. It's a little bit harder to pull something out when it's bound up with fiber, or when it's closely related to fiber. So that kind of brings us to that last bullet point, like, what's the fiber mineral or fiber vitamin interaction look like? How hard do we have to work through that fiber to try to get out the nutrition? Mineral to mineral interaction, what are we co-ingesting with it mineral-wise? If they have the same molecular weight, they say have the same mass, they might actually compete for transporters. And vitamin-mineral interaction, there is actually vitamins that kind of counteract or facilitate the absorption of different minerals and vice versa. A good example of this is there's certain drugs that you actually can't take vitamin C with, or you can't drink with, like grapefruit juice and stuff like that, because it actually inactivates it or has a negative interaction, right? Like, some of this type of stuff can be big time deals. So one of the major minerals is going to be calcium. Most of us know that it's going to be highly responsible for things like bone, right? But it's also super important for blood clotting, for nervous system impulses, for enzyme activation. We also synthesize calciferol, which is a form of vitamin D in some way. and it's going to help us transport things across cell membranes. But the big one is going to be bones. It's the one that most people remember, and realistically, that's probably the one that affects us the most. What you guys should remember from anatomy is that bone is far from inert. Bone is actively moving. Bone is in constant turnover. It's in constant flux, in a constant state of remodeling. When we're actually breaking down bone to create calcium, we're going to be using our osteoclasts. When we're reforming bone and building up bone, we're going to be using osteoblasts. Think catabolic osteoclasts, building osteoblasts. Well, if we have this like super specific reserve of calcium, then clearly it's going to be an important mineral for us to make sure that we're having in the correct amounts. And since we have such a fine-tunable mechanism for maintaining calcium, it stands to reason that we will probably have a very specific range of blood calcium that we're actually happy with. And that is completely the truth. If you do not get enough calcium in the diet, we'll break our bones down and we'll increase the calcium inside of our blood. If you're getting enough calcium in our diet, we'll actually put that calcium into our bone to help maintain kind of a constant level as much as we can of calcium. Now, just because it's important and just because we have this finely tuned mechanism, does that mean that we don't need to put calcium into our diet? Absolutely no way, shape, or form. You need to be consuming calcium, and we need to be meeting the RDA. This is kind of a goofy thing to think about, right? If it's super, super important, do you think that we do a good enough job getting it in? Well, in some ways we do, right? Like in some ways we do get it in decent amounts. 25% of us get it in decent amounts. It's not terrible, right? If you consider that 51% of us are obese or more than that, I think it's probably closer to 60%, right? Like clearly some of us are doing some things right, but at the same time, we tend to be deficient in it, right? The overwhelming majority, 75% of Americans, are failing to meet the RDA. And that starts at children under 5 years old, and that kind of perpetuates throughout the rest of the aging groups. So it really is something that we need to work on. Do we do a good enough job of it? No. Do some of us do a really good job of it? Yeah, for sure. But you don't want to like argue with outliers. So a big thing that I want you guys to pay attention to here is look at how the recommended daily intake, the RDA, actually changes across time, across the age span, the health span, however you want to put it. As we age, we increase in the need of our calcium up to about 18 years old. This is when puberty is maximizing. This is when our growth is maximizing. After our growth kind of settles out, our calcium need decreases because our bones have stopped growing. And then once we hit 51 and older, we're starting to break bone down. We're getting a little bit older, getting a little bit more frail. So we're actually having to bump our calcium levels back up. So it's almost this biphasic needs graph, if you will, for calcium. We have to actually boost our calcium in young age and then boost it again when we're older. That way we can make sure that we're trying to maintain as much bone health as possible. This is something that's super important for the females. Females tend to have a general gradual decline of bone mineral density starting at about the age of 30. So you realistically have until about 30 years old to peak your bone mineral density, after which time it's kind of a controlled skid. So you need to make sure that you're consuming calcium, right? You need to make sure that you're getting it in adequate levels, whether that's from milk, that's from cheese, that's from supplements, because you're lactose intolerant, whatever, you need to make sure you're getting it in. So if it's that important, what happens when we go a prolonged period of time without calcium? We can probably guess that we're going to have bone loss, right? We're going to be losing bone in some way, shape, or form. So we're actually going to lose bone mineral content, and our bones are going to become porous, they're going to become hollow, and they're going to become more easily breakable or brittle. Sorry. That's what the next couple of figures are going to be talking about, right? So what you can see here is this is the mechanism by which this is going on. In the top, we're going to have calcium that's being absorbed by the small intestine, put into the blood, and then put into the bone. If we lack dietary calcium, or we have an inability to bring it in through absorption, then we're actually going to recycle the calcium that's inside of our bone and put it into our blood. That way we can make sure that we maintain that level of calcium. So that would be our osteoclast and osteoblast activity, breaking it down and building it up. Clasts, blasts. So over on the right-hand side, you're going to see just some really, really terrible figures of trying to get you to imagine what normal versus osteopenic versus osteoporotic bone looks like. So you can tell the white is going to be, or that cream color is actually going to be our healthy bone, and those dark spots are going to be more like those porous layers or those holes, if you will. It's church bone, it's holy. So as we actually move down that chain, as we move from normal to osteopenic to osteoporotic to severe osteoporotic, we're actually going to be making less strong bone and more brittle bone. Now, is it to say that the only way that you're going to get this is with low calcium? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Genetic factors play a huge role in this. Hormone levels play a huge role. Body weight, medications. There's medications that will actually induce this in some way, shape, or form. It's scary. That's why you need to pay attention to everything that you're putting inside of your mouth. And if you know that you're at a family disease history of this, of osteoporosis, you need to be trying to maximize your calcium intake, your weight-bearing exercise, all that type of stuff. Now, phosphorus is another one of those major minerals that we absolutely have to have. Big reason why we have to have phosphorus. What is adenosine triphosphate? That's right, phosphorus, right? Phosphate, phosphorus, it's one and the same. It's just what it's bound to make it phosphate. So it is 100% requisite. If we do not have phosphorus, we do not have ATP. If we do not have ATP, what happens? Like X my eyes, right? Like put some coins over my eyes and send me off on a ship and shoot it with a flaming arrow. That is how they would bury Vikings, for those of you guys that are unfamiliar. So why do we care about it? Well, ATP, huge. Also, it's going to combine with calcium, right? So not only do we have to worry about our calcium intake, we have to worry about our phosphorus intake. And this phosphorus-calcium combination is going to be one of the things that actually contributes rigidity to our bones, as well as our teeth, right? Because teeth are bones. So it makes sense that we would follow calcium with phosphorus. And for those of you guys that are also interested in it, we also make phospholipids, or that phospholipid bilayer, right? The thing that makes up the cell membrane is going to be one of the key components is going to be phosphorus. Again, phosphorus. Magnesium is really kind of a cool one. I don't want you guys to worry about memorizing this chart over here on the left, right? Like that's insane. This is literally graduate level biochemistry that is going on over here. I don't want you guys to worry too much about it. I just want to highlight a couple things on it. Anytime you see an arrow in something like this, it means that it's stimulating. Anytime you see this kind of line right here, it means that it's actually blocking something. So what you can see is that magnesium is actually stimulating the breakdown of glucose. So we're stimulating hexokinase, they call it glucokinase here. We're stimulating glycolysis, we're stimulating pyruvate dehydrogenase, we're stimulating the production of acetyl-CoA, and we're stimulating mitochondria. But what we're doing is we're actually blocking the kind of transportation, if you will, or the changing of glucose 6-phosphate back into glucose and sending it back out of the cell. So we're forcing that glucose towards oxidation and towards burning it, essentially with magnesium. So magnesium is super important because it helps control carbohydrate breakdown. That is the big thing that I want you guys to pay attention to. Super important because it helps control carbohydrate breakdown and ATP production. Super cool. Iron. Why do we care about iron? Right? Iron is one of the key components of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is how we transport oxygen on red blood cells. If we do not have hemoglobin, if we do not have iron, then we do not have functioning red blood cells. If we don't have functioning red blood cells, we can't transport oxygen, and we can't get oxygen to our tissues. If we don't have oxygen, we can't make ATP in appreciable quantities, and we die, right? Like super important stuff here. So what happens when you become deficient in iron? It's a condition called anemia, and it's associated with persistent fatigue, a rapid heartbeat, sometimes headache. What essentially is going on here is that we're losing red blood cells, or it's a low red blood cell count. So you have an inability to transport oxygen, you have an inability to produce ATP, and a lot of that is brought on by a lack of iron. Is it exclusively brought on by a lack of iron? No, we're going to talk about it. Just so you guys are aware, this is one one area that I want you guys paying attention to. That's RDAs and clinical cutoffs for what anemia would be. So what iron source are you going to get the most bang for your buck from? Typically, iron that comes from heme sources, heme iron or animal sources. Think red meat here, right? Like you're literally eating red meat because it's bloody. Kind of weird, but that's going to be the most bioavailable. So that is the most bang for your buck, right? 10 to 35% absorption. Whereas if we're going from plants, we're looking at 2 to 10%. So we could be, what is that? What's 16 times greater absorption if we're consuming red meat compared to plants. Something to pay attention to if you're working with vegetarian or vegan athletes, or you're working with someone that's been bit by a Lone Star tick that's allergic to red meat, or someone that just generally doesn't eat red meat. Super important things that you got to pay attention to when you're working with someone is how are they getting their iron and how bioavailable is it? Another condition that kind of is presented, and this is still a growing field, so there's not a whole bunch known about it, and that's called sports anemia or hemolysis. Essentially what's going on with sports anemia is that as we heel strike, as we foot strike on the ground, there's a compression of the capillary beds. When we compress those capillary beds inside of the feet, we actually rupture the red blood cells, and that causes a loss of red blood cells. When those red blood cells break, they actually lose iron, and so we start exhibiting anemic-like characteristics. Think of this like a really low-grade bruise on the bottom of your feet from repetitive pounding of your feet, right? It's kind of crazy, but it definitely does happen. It's been diagnosed before. So just like everything else we've talked about, there's a bunch of factors that are going to affect iron absorption. Where it's being absorbed from, what's the source that we're consuming it from, what's your body's demand, do we actually have a demand for more red blood cells or not, what's the vitamin C content look like, what else is in the stomach or in the intestines as we're going through this kind of absorption situation. If we're over consuming other minerals, they might outcompete that iron. So it's kind of this really interesting quagmire. But in general, as long as you're eating those red meat sources or you're eating good iron from good bioavailable sources, you're probably going to be fine. If you happen to be predisposed or already anemic, this is where things like iron supplementation can come into play and can be extremely helpful. So our sodium, potassium, and chlorine, these are going to be our colloquially termed electrolytes. You drink any bottle of Gatorade, anything that says that it has electrolytes in it, this is what you're going to be drinking, right? Sodium, potassium, super important for a lot of different things. Big one's going to be sodium potassium pump. If we eliminate or dysregulate the electrical signaling, which is sodium potassium pump, if we deregulate the ability of our muscles and our nervous system to signal normally and fire normally, we're going to have issues with contraction. We're going to have issues with excitation contraction. A major concern when low blood potassium occurs is something called hypokalemia. And hypokalemia can be an extremely life-threatening condition because of the extreme deviations in heart rate that occur. We can massively shift the heart rate and actually cause severe damage with hypokalemia and eventual death. It's a scary situation. Patients that are undergoing chemotherapy regimens or have frequent vomiting and diarrhea are at risk of hypokalemia. So you have to pay really close attention to these types of things. So because we're so used to seeing electrolytes associated with exercise and replenishing sweat, I wanted you guys to see about how much sodium, potassium, calcium, right? How much of these electrolytes are actually found in sweat versus in Coke, Gatorade, that type of stuff. So kind of a cool table for you to kind of get an idea of what's being lost versus what's being replenished when you drink these things. Cool. So this probably is the most common kind of electrolyte for you guys to think about when you're thinking about these, and that's going to be sodium. And sodium's typically associated with blood pressure changes, or at least blood volume changes. Now, there is, we'll get into it. All right, I was going to go on a tangent here, and we'll talk about it. Essentially, when there's low to moderate sodium consumption, aldosterone is going to be released. This hormone is actually responsible for conserving sodium. So if we have low dietary sodium, we have a release of aldosterone to try to hold on to sodium at the kidney level. So we're actually trying to maintain our plasma volume and maintain our plasma sodium level. So there's a drug class that's going to be responsible for blocking this. It's going to be called an ACE inhibitor. Rather than go too far into this, Know that it stands for angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. Its goal is to block this function and increase the excretion of sodium, hoping to drop our blood pressure. So a lot of times this is a drug that like your parents might be on if they have high blood pressure. In general, what I'm trying to get at here is that abnormal sodium handling can lead to increased body fluid and increased blood pressure. So have you guys ever heard of someone saying they're salt sensitive, right? This is what they're talking about. When they consume salt and consume sodium, they actually hold on to water. Now, this is a very small percentage of people, and this is where sodium's actually gotten as misnomer. Sodium is not necessarily bad. Sodium guidelines tend to be set really, 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 really low here, and it might not necessarily be the best thing in the world for sodium to be that low. Regardless, there is a dietary approach. It's actually a pretty well-known diet called the DASH diet, and that's the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension diet. It's an approach that is used to dramatically lower sodium in the diet in hopes of kind of combating elevated blood pressure, increased blood pressure. That increased blood pressure is associated with negative cardiovascular outcomes. So we want to make sure that we're trying to balance all this out. So the goal is to essentially replenish, but not over-replenish the sodium that gets lost in sweat. Since we're talking about sweat, we might as well talk about water, right? Our final couple of slides, slide 48, 49, and 50 are going to talk about water. So rather than harp too much, most of you guys probably understand what water is doing inside the blood, right? It's serving as a transport mechanism. Our blood is almost exclusively water. It is high levels of water. We're also going to help facilitate the diffusion of gas across moist body surfaces. Our lungs are moist, they have surfactant. If we don't have that surfactant on our alveoli, then we can't transfer oxygen back and forth as well, carbon dioxide back and forth, nitrogen back and forth, right? Water is going to help kind of facilitate gas movement, if you will. It's going to help us transport urine and poop, right? Feces. It's going to help us eliminate waste products. It's going to help absorb heat, and it's going to help disperse heat for us. It's going to help lubricate our joints so it's not nothing but friction, and it's going to help perform some sort of structure, provide some sort of structure for us, right? Clearly, it is incredibly important. So we got to make sure that we're consuming water in the right amount. In general, sedentary adult is going to require about 2.5 liters of water per day. As you increase in activity, that level needs to scale up pretty dramatically. We'll talk later about kind of intake requirements. But in general, that it needs to scale up. If it's a hot, humid environment, it needs to scale up even more. This could be as much as 10 liters or more of water per day. Funny enough, kind of cool enough, water and fluid consumption is not the only way that we actually get water. Have you ever thought about that? Like, fluid consumption is not the only way that we actually get water. We get it from our foods, which is kind of neat. Like, clearly, if you're eating a protein shake, it's mainly fluid, so it's mainly water, unless it's milk. Or almond milk, which then it's basically water, right? So we get water from food. If you're eating fruits, if you're eating grapes, if you're eating those high water foods, watermelon, there it is. I was trying to get there and I couldn't think of it. Water from food is going to be another major source. In class, we also talked about the concept of metabolic water, how we actually kind of scavenge those reactive oxygen species in some way, shape, or form, loosely, and create a water. So we actually produce some of the metabolic water that we need inside the body. And we lose water by fecal loss, sweat, and urine. You guys know that when you drink a ton of water, you pee a ton. We're actually cycling it through and eliminating the water that we don't need. So this is just another example for you guys to see about how much water input and water output comes in through a day. If you look, when we're in little or no physical activity conditions in a temperate environment, we're going to pretty much match our input and our output. But if we're in a hot, humid environment, our input might not match our output. And that means that we're going to have contracted plasma volume. Our body's not going to work as good. If anyone's ever had a heat stroke or heat illness, you know what I'm talking about. When you're in this condition, it's not a good thing. So that's it, guys. We survived micronutrients. We did it. Rock on. Next video that's going to launch is on digestion and absorption, and we should be all caught up. See you guys next week.